much for being here. I know how much life demands of people, and so your time is very precious, and I'm very grateful that you're spending it here. So I wanted to start by just thanking some people. I wanted to thank Dr. Paula Castagno for inviting me and organizing. Giovanna for being my sponsor, for being a visiting researcher here, and then introducing me, and for many other people I've had wonderful conversations with. So thank you so much for everybody who's stimulated my thinking while I've been here, and for creating the place that this is. It's been a wonderful place. So I've been So I've been working on topics related to, music and groups. How do people come together to do, have shared agencies, do things together? And at a certain point, I sort of thought that, climate change is this global emergency, and that everybody should be, and this doesn't apply to you necessarily, but I thought for myself, everything should be directed towards climate change, like whether or not I'm good at thinking about that, or whether or not I have experience thinking about that. I wanted to try to see what I was already working on might have to say, or might contribute, or might have to offer for thinking through things that have to do with climate change and how we're going to adapt. So it pulls together kind of three different threads in my thinking, this talk does. And it's kind of this idea that it's not just kind of engineers and politicians that we need to adapt to climate change, but we need, humanities, thinkers, philosophers, other sorts of, people involved in trying to shape our society and things for the changes that are coming. My secret agenda is to kind of justify a greater amount of music in our lives, because my secret, agenda is undercurrent to the talk is that doing music kind of creates the virtues that are needed for climate change, namely cooperation, which is part of one of the major topics of the talk. So music creates this, and it also helps deal with trauma, which is the other kind of current in it. So, I leave that to the imagination how that might happen. We have our visiting researcher from Norway who talked about that at the Cognition and Culture, a little bit about music in early childhood education and how important that is. But yeah, in general, I'm thinking if we changed viewing music from like a commodity or an entertainment experience and had it, more as a way of building capacities, similar to literacy and numeracy and these sorts of things. In particular, the trauma and the cooperation features of music are what would be cultivated. So a lot of talk is kind of like motivating that in a way, like saying that, talking about these two topics, trauma and cooperation in relation to climate change. So why those? If philosophy were a tree, my way of doing philosophy would be very much kind of where branches meet. So it wouldn't really be where the leaves are or down in a lot of very finely delineated precise thinking. It would be more bringing together a few different kind of concepts or bodies of literature and seeing how they would talk to each other in a way. So it's a bit of a broad sort of a talk in that it's kind of bringing these three ideas together. And so some of you might find this kind of not that precise, but it's a beginning kind of direction for research. So if you have more precision available in your mind that you'd like to tell me about for me to use for going forward, I would really appreciate hearing about what you think and things like that. So that's my kind of explanation about what's going on and why I'm talking about these things and whatnot. So virtue ethics. So the first thing that I've decided to talk about is this virtue of cooperation. So I'm going back to talk about what virtue ethics is, and then what environmental virtue ethics is, and then telling you what cooperation as a virtue is. So if you already know about virtue ethics, then this is just going to be, telling about something you already know. But I thought it would be worth bringing it forward into the room anyway. It's a very common, well-known approach to normative ethics. Probably everybody's either taught this or studied this in undergrad as a philosophy student or teacher. It comes from an ancient source, the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, and has been, was brought forward, of course, through in the West through the church up into the Middle Ages, thinking about ethics as virtues. That's kind of been a little bit, I would say, abandoned in the contemporary, that kind of church kind of a way of preserving the ethics. But the contemporary thinkers, Rosalind Hursthouse, Christine Swanton, Michael Sloat, these sorts of people do look to Aristotle and pick those things up that are in there and kind of try to put them in conversation with utilitarianism and deontology and other kind of contemporary ethics. I think virtue ethics, it really appeals to me as a way of thinking about ethics, because it has a lot to do with habits and happiness and flourishing and what's good, and has a lot to say about what appears good and motivational structure in action. And so, how do we value the right things and become properly motivated to do the actions that are good, rather than more or less just judging what actions are right and wrong. So there's less judgment, more life advice, or integrated into other topics that are interesting, like perception and action, and those kinds of topics that are of interest. So one thing that it offers is a rich vocabulary, as I was saying. It's not just right or wrong, obligatory, supererogatory, these sorts of things, but it has more nuanced vocabulary judgments, like honest, cruel, courageous, generous. These are all effectively judgments, but they give more of a qualitative way of describing an action, say, or a character trait. Again, these can also apply to different kinds of levels. So it could be an action, it could be a disposition, a character. So it allows you to talk about things more flexibly than just right or wrong action. And the virtues are effectively, capacities. I think of them as capacities for creating an optimal situation. So kind of ways of being that are well suited to a certain type of condition. So, environmental virtue ethicist I'll talk about later, Roland Sandler, says a virtue is a disposition to respond to considerations in the world in excellent ways. So you could, plug in what you mean by excellent, but so he continues, if the suffering of others is bad and one is indifferent to it or aims to cause it, then one fails to respond well to a morally salient fact about the world. Therefore, cruelty and insensitivity toward the suffering of others are vices, and compassion towards others is a virtue. To paraphrase Aristotle, a virtuous person is disposed to respond to the right thing for the right reason in the right way, while also having the right desires and feelings about it. Yeah, so virtues are effectively dispositions to respond to situations in a certain way. So it's not just doing the action, but also especially how your perception and your feelings are connected to that action. So there's all sorts of complex moral psychology enabled by thinking about virtue ethics, like feeling afraid but realizing that it's more important to be brave in this moment. And there's there's all sorts of rich ways to describe what it is to do a right action that values the subjective experience and whatnot. And so yeah, it's a way of kind of developing your perception and developing your action and through habit building. Because they're sort of one thing that I like about talking about cooperation through the virtue model, which you could talk about it just as a feature of the world, but as a virtue, it allows that people don't always know how to do it, or people don't always have the capacity to do it. Virtue ethics allows that you don't always already know how to do what the right thing is, that it takes kind of habituation training. There's a lot of discussion about kind of mimicry or kind of being scaffolded into your behavior in virtue ethics, things like that. So this idea that it needs to be built up and it needs to be something that takes time to develop, it needs to be worked on in order to be a possibility of action really for you, is something I like about the virtue, because it's more looking into kind of the preconditions that are needed for this to be possible. So a little bit of a backstory about environmental virtue ethics in particular. So you're probably familiar, if you're at all familiar with environmental ethics, with David Thoreau, Rachel Carson, and Aldo Leopold. Environmental virtue ethicists that I've read claim these are virtue ethicists. Debatable, but I think they are, in that they focus on, certain ways of approaching nature that would be valuable morally, and that would be ones that should be cultivated. So they spend a fair bit of time talking about the cultivation of ways of dealing with the environment, in short. Kind of those are just kind of like almost like the ancestors standing in the background, but the kind of contemporary conversation really kind of starts with Thomas Hill in The Ideals of Human Excellence and Preserving the Natural Environment, where he argues, he's explaining his experience of watching his neighbor cut down their tree for a very poor reason, some sort of, it's in the way of the view, something like this. So they cut down a tree, and Hill is kind of reflecting on, like, why is this wrong? He's kind of like figuring out, like, what is wrong about this? And for him, he was noticing that he thought, what kind of person would do this? He thought, what kind of person would do this? It wasn't really about the rights of the tree, the sentience of the tree, the inherent value of the tree, all these kind of ways that people approach environmental ethics, using, deontology, rights language, utilitarian vocabularies. He felt drawn to talking about virtue, like what kind of person would do this? Like that is what freaks him out the most about it, is that somebody would just be so careless and just not see any value in that tree. So the way that Hill kind of worked that out was that he saw this as a failure of humility. He called this improper humility, a failure to appreciate things that are important. And he saw this as kind of a precursor to other normal virtues, such as, maybe benevolence or compassion, so he brought up this idea of kind of pre-virtues or the virtues that would be needed for other virtues. And so a lot of things in environmental virtue ethics have centered around, which virtues are required for which other virtues and whatnot. And so, people have suggested environmental virtues can be discussed in that kind of a realm, like as precursors to the other virtues that are kind of human-centered. So you maybe are familiar with the idea of, I think Kant said, we shouldn't mistreat animals because, it's kind of sounding like a virtue ethic-y version of this, but we shouldn't mistreat animals because it would make us treat humans poorly, something like that. Is anybody else more familiar? So that's right. So that's very human. Basically, the values are about humans, but people say, well, we should treat animals or the environment better because of how it'll help us treat humans better. So it's still basically the anthropocentric kind of view, but it allows for there to be environmental values in there about dispositions of character that would apply to the environment. Other people have, Hearst House in 2007 has kind of argued that protecting the environment promotes human flourishing. So it's still, this kind of human-centered view, but it allows that there's this kind of mutual implication of the environment flourishing and human flourishing. So this has been kind of expanded into for a human to flourish and have a good life, they need a clean environment, they need biodiversity around them. So again, it's still centered sort of a little bit in the human, but it's a way of nevertheless kind of tying in the natural world with our virtue. So that's just a little bit of the background, I suppose. These books have been the most kind of influential ones in this 2000s, these early kind of 2000s. I'm going to talk to you about these two a little bit more in a moment. But I also wanted to mention there's a book published in 2020 called The Book of Ecological Virtues, Living Well in the Anthropocene. So there are quite a lot of attempts to, define what the environmental virtues are, how they related to other virtues, and this sort of thing. A very interesting, I think, book in the environmental virtue ethics field is this book by Luc van Wensveen, who's an interesting writer. What she's done in this one is kind of look at do a discourse analysis and look at the ways that people talk about value of environment in the environmental movement and in other sorts of places. And she argues that they all talk about virtue. They all use kind of language of virtues in one way or another, that there's some sort of, this is not kind of it's not ridiculous to pursue an environmental virtue ethics in that it's already kind of implied in the discourse. So hers is an interesting way of kind of laying the groundwork for this type of approach. And everybody kind of subsequently then refers back to her book. Another thing just to point out about hers that I'm going to bring up in a moment is, she notes that the virtues tend to be, ones that include a vision. What she says is a vision of ecologically sustainable societies. Ecological virtue discourse thus derives much of its impetus from a social ideal. She says it's a discourse committed to social change without a developed theory of social change. So this sense that the virtues are the way that people talk about being ecologically virtuous have some sort of social ideal, or meaning a virtue about how to be with other people, but they tend to be more articulated as sort of private experiences like reverence for nature or thriftiness, or in any case, something other than what I'll talk about in a moment as kind of political virtues. So she's already making this a little bit of a critique that there isn't enough of a kind of sort of a political or collective emphasis on the way that these virtues are defined. But to talk about this other book briefly, Sandler's book is really supposed to kind of set the agenda, and also is one of these kind of foundational books in what has come after. He talks about, he lists the environmental virtues. So he says that there are 5 different categories of these virtues. Virtues of sustainability, such as temperance and frugality, of communion with nature, attentiveness and wonder, respect for nature, care, compassion, and ecological sensitivity, virtues of stewardship, honesty, diligence, and then virtues of activism. So this is where cooperativeness comes in. So cooperativeness and perseverance. So he lists them all, and among them is cooperativeness. So now I'm going to kind of go a little bit more directly, although still indirectly, but moving towards directly into talking about cooperation and in what way that's environmental virtue and whatnot, because it's an example of the kind of thing that was one of these kind of social virtues or what have you. Okay, so just to note one more kind of thinker about this. This is a relatively recent article. Brian Tremor has argued that environmental virtue ethics has been somewhat too individualist in emphasizing private virtues such as humility, wonder, appreciation for nature, and those sorts of things. Nevertheless, he says environmental problems are often the result of an agglomeration of individually insignificant actions, and as such, they require solutions that address collective action. So this kind of, just going to skip forward just slightly because it's just for time. So this guy, Brian Tremor, is one of the few people kind of arguing that environmental virtues include things like public virtues, like being politically involved, and in particular cooperation. Working with others in a certain way is part of being doing the right thing for the environment and what have you. He also emphasizes cooperation as one of these virtues. So what is that? So the virtue of cooperation is discussed by two kind of prominent current thinkers about environmental virtue ethics. So I'm going to talk about them one by one, and the first is Kent Peacock. So I've this is my gloss on what he sort of says, and so it's the ability to work together with others on a common project, irrespective of one's feelings, judgments, or standing relative to them. And the project shouldn't be one of antagonism towards others, he says. So that's an important part of it that'll be more clear later. The why doesn't count as cooperation if you're cooperating to harm other people. So his view is that he says climate change challenges humanity to act on the basis of intelligent, creative foresight on a planetary scale. What set of excellences would give us the best chance of overcoming the challenges that we now face? So talking about virtues as this apt response to a situation. He says a number of recent authors have drawn attention to the virtue of cooperation. And he links cooperation with this notion of hyper-pro-social behavior, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's an evolutionary biology term, or anthropology. Curtis Marion has used this term, which he defines as a uniquely human capacity to cooperate with unrelated individuals for a common purpose. So included in this kind of explanation of Marion's view, too often members of a tribe or nation may be pro-social only to more effectively slaughter some other group that they perceive as a competitor. The human species has yet to learn the trick of being reliably pro-social on a planetary scale, even though we face survival challenges such as anthropogenic climate change that can only be addressed on a planetary scale. So that's how, he's talking about cooperation, is this kind of need to work together on a planetary scale. He's also very, his main virtue that he's bringing up is the virtue of creative foresight. Creative foresight for him is the virtue, not cooperation. So he's talking about cooperation, he's talking about it as an important one, but he's worried about groupthink or some sort of limit on creative foresight that might be implied in cooperation. So while he's an advocate of cooperation as a virtue, he also thinks it's important to have this creative foresight virtue. So the other person to talk about this is Brian Williston. And he, is the main person that has kind of inspired my thinking about linking this up with trauma. And just understanding this, being interested in this topic of cooperation as a virtue. So this other person, the way that I described Peacock's view in the previous slide, I think is consistent with what Brian Williston says about cooperation. Brian Williston's view of it is effectively defined around the prisoner's dilemma, more or less. So if you're already familiar with that, I'm sure you are. I'm going to explain it very briefly, but I would guess that you probably might know about it. In any case, so he kind of defines cooperation relative to that paradigm in a manner of speaking. So it pretty much is kind of viewed in that. So I'll explain that in a moment. But he raises this virtue of cooperation in that in the context of the prisoner's dilemma, because pretty sure I'd go into this more in a moment. But in the prisoner's dilemma, it's pretty much a parable for why not to cooperate in that setting where you have more or less these two characters who could cooperate and achieve some sort of more optimal outcome, but just the strategy of thinking encouraged in that prisoner's dilemma would lead them to kind of sell out the other person. And so this is kind of a model for, it's a really interesting way of trying to figure out what the virtue it really is. So he's saying that once you have this virtue of cooperation, you could, as he's saying here, not engage in this calculated wait and see behavior. So not saying like, okay, well, I will think about what if my, cooperatee, betrays the agreement. If they do that, then what would be my strategy? So rather than thinking strategically for one's own advantage, one is using this virtue of cooperation not to seek one's own advantage, like not to think about like, but what if the other person doesn't follow through with me? So basically to risk a worse outcome for yourself in seeking a more optimal outcome collectively achieved. So he sees this this kind of ethic of non-cooperativeness as kind of characteristic of a corporate sort of capitalist mindset. Or it's kind of like what he kind of links up with this idea of competition, people competing with each other, cooperating for a purpose, but with the ultimate purpose of oneself winning. So having this limited cooperation mindset. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I just want to mention here that there's, just as a third way of talking about what cooperation is, there's a book by Ramo Chomela called Cooperation, a Philosophical Study, which is something like a nice book. And where he defines cooperation is a social action requiring the contribution of several people towards a shared goal or purpose. And he distinguishes between something called we mode and I mode. And we mode is where, you know, the kind of one you're imagining winning or losing is us together, versus, you know, the way that you're entering this collective action is through your own benefit in mind. So I think that kind of maps this idea of cooperation versus competition that Wilson's kind of bringing out. So you can enter these kind of shared action scenarios, thinking collectively or basically thinking individually. So okay, so yeah, sometimes I just don't know what to put on a slide, so that's why you have this. Okay, so so cooperativeness, this is just more about what I was just talking about. Okay, so not only Williston, but others have said, and it kind of does in some ways stand to reason, that cooperation isn't really cultivated as a virtue in our society. It's not one that is encouraged or is practiced. So just going back to Luke Van Wensben in Dirty Ethics. So she talks just about the values that are promoted in a kind of a business setting. She says, you know, take for example the language generated by Western corporate cultures. If one needs to make a profit in business, it generally helps to be tough, efficient, and shrewd. It may also help to be caring and trustworthy, but usually these traits are defined as being toughness. Although the same combination of traits might help for environmental goals, environmentally minded people don't speak this way. Talk about humility and sensitivity, not shrewdness. And so she's just giving a bit of an example of the kinds of things that are valued in kind of a capitalist kind of work environment. That's also something Williston is going on about a lot too, that in this kind of like consumer capitalist culture, it's not cooperation that's the dominant skill with respect to other people, but actually it's this kind of prisoner's dilemma style thing where you're going to cooperate until it's not in your interest, and you're willing to double cross them at any moment anyway for your own benefit. So yeah, this is just all to say that, you know, even though the virtue of cooperation is called for perhaps for environmental ethical reasons, it's not the one that's being trained in our society at the moment. So this leads to this idea that we need to change the virtues that we have. Think about, this is another approach, rather than just making environmental ethics kind of subservient to the traditional human-centered flourishing virtues. People are also coming up with new virtues, saying, well, this is now a virtue. One of them is adaptation. So this is this book that is really just arguing that, you know, being adaptive is itself a virtue in the, you know, era of climate change. So, but it's also the idea that we need to adapt new virtues for us, like come up with new ways of being. So that seems to be true. I mean, it's you know, I think it's true that whatever it is that got us here in the history of the planet, isn't going to help us likely get out of the climate trouble. So the kind of issue is that we need to have different virtues, but the virtues we have are the ones that allow us to function best in this context. And that those are virtues of competition and kind of individualism. And so other virtues are kind of needed, but where are we going to sort of get those virtues from? It's like we need those virtues in the future, or basically now, but virtues take a while to kind of cook and become ready to go. So recently, this is kind of just the same sort of idea that this virtue is called for, that this virtue of cooperation is being called for, on many different levels, but recently, by this Secretary General of the United Nations at COP27 says humanity's a choice, cooperate or perish. So puts this idea of cooperation as like the way we're going to get out of climate change. And what he really means by that is, he means something specific in a manner of speaking, the West giving money to the developing nations to help them, I think, with their climate adaptation. But it's a really interesting thing to say, especially kind of in the background to this prisoner's dilemma, which kind of, frames cooperation as suboptimal, whereas it's not really what's personally advantageous. But if the alternative is to perish or cooperate, then it's not, it's no longer disadvantageous to cooperate. Again, that whole thing assumes kind of mutual competition. So if you're starting from a point of mutual competition, you might have to be kind of sort of threatened into cooperating. So if we were thinking, in a different mindset about that wasn't kind of the corporate kind of capitalist one that is already assuming antagonism and competition, perhaps we would need to be kind of threatened into it. But in any case, yeah, I did have a lot more to say about this, just about the types of when cooperation is already being already a virtue for people, like there's a power issue involved in it. People who've succeeded in this like capitalist corporate structure have really taken on this virtue of competition and non-cooperation, or limited cooperation and self-interest. So our leaders are pretty much good at that because they've succeeded in kind of getting to those positions in society. But people with less power are better at cooperating because for various reasons, in short. So in some situations where you can't, and this is shown in iterative versions of the prisoner's dilemma, where you can continue making decisions with the same person over time, and you get to know whether they're going to betray you or cooperate each time, and you come to have knowledge of them. That leads to more cooperation. So in situations where you can sell out your partner, leave, and have no consequences, that discourages cooperation. And it's more a feature of power to be able to do that, rather than having less power and needing to continue operating with the same people. So when it comes to this question of virtues, I think it's important to kind of distinguish, political actors or corporate actors, and then kind of like everyday people. Yeah, it's just important, I think, to distinguish it. Nevertheless, there's a lot more to say about that. Anyway, I'm going to move over from talking about that to talking about trauma. So ultimately, what I'm thinking of in this is, climate change is going to increase the amount of trauma for people. Additionally, there's already a lot of trauma for people happening now. Partly because of other things that I think. Trauma makes it hard to cooperate, but I'm going to explain a bit more how that is. But trauma really affects our way of being in time, especially related to the future. And it therefore is a consideration when we think about, is cooperation really the virtue we need? Or if it is, we should think about it while also taking into consideration the impact of trauma. So, you could say that cooperation is a virtue, but if no one's really able to cooperate because they're all traumatized, or in a very general way of speaking, then it's something that needs to be changed, sort of thing. That if people are, never mind. Okay, so climate change and trauma. So it's going to increase trauma. There's 3 ways that it's going to increase trauma: direct, indirect, and what I've called knowledge, but through being aware of climate change. So the direct is just what we already kind of know as natural disasters. Being in a natural disaster can create sort of episodic trauma. And that has the added feature of, previous trauma impacts the severity of those situations on your ability to cope. But yeah, so you have direct from things like that. Indirect is referring to things like migration, food insecurity, loss of land, those kinds of things. Changes to our world that indirectly lead to more trauma. So migration is connected with PTSD and depression, anxiety disorders, emotional and behavioral problems, and so on. And the third one, the one we hear a lot about, is inadequately signaled here by the word knowledge, but anxiety, climate anxiety. People are worried about climate change. They feel like politicians are doing nothing. It's kind of, there's like a trauma linked to seeing it on TV, accessing it as a something coming, but that isn't faceable. So somehow knowing about it in this way also creates a trauma. So yeah, I could tell you more about why it's going to increase trauma, but I think it's clear that there'll be more trauma. So what is trauma? Okay, so it's essentially something that's overwhelming and cannot be kind of metabolized or digested. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this book, The Body Keeps the Score, but it's published in 2016 and is a sort of very influential and important book on trauma. So it has a lot to offer in terms of explaining what trauma is. So that's going to be kind of my source, more so than talking about Husserl, which I'm going to talk about briefly. But so he's really about talking about the prevalence of trauma. So I won't get into all the details, but really emphasizing that early childhood situations are creating a lot more trauma in society than people really want to talk about or address. So I'm not going to be talking about that sort of source of trauma that much, but it is worth saying that in addition to the climate change trauma, there's also, he has some very harrowing statistics about how much early life abuse is really going on for him in the States anyway. So that's kind of in the background too, that if we take a lot of the other effects, then in short, he's trying to argue that a lot of things that we see as just kind of caused by biology or what have you are actually kind of caused by unprocessed trauma and things like this. So effects of trauma. So okay, different types of trauma. In short, I'm just referring to it in a general way when I'm talking about the effects of trauma, but there should be distinguished 4 different types: kind of single event, ongoing, developmental, and intergenerational. There's a lot to say there about how they're different, how they're the same, but in short, let's just treat them as trauma. So it can affect everyday perception in the following way. Van der Kolk, this is kind of from his book. So he says, traumatized people have a tendency to superimpose their trauma on everything around them and have trouble deciphering, the trauma from the non-trauma. It kind of fundamentally reorganizes the brain. Most pertinently, it makes the subject closed to possibilities. It affects imagination. It creates kind of a chronic vigilance. So loss of mental flexibility, less imagination, decreased risk experimenting, kind of becomes stuck, can't integrate new experiences as well. It's hard to imagine situations other than disastrous situations, and less kind of alive in the present. People talk about the traumatized mind as sort of stuck in the past, reliving the past. So one of the kind of therapy tasks for trauma is kind of the realization that was then and this is now, or to put something in the past. So in short, it creates these kind of, it's not just flashbacks. It kind of can change your entire perceptual structure, in short. And in particular can affect your way of living time. And in this particular sense that, you're probably familiar with people when they're having a flashback, or in the case of PTSD, that they're thinking that something in the past is happening now. So it feels like it's happening now, but it's actually in the past. And what they must do is kind of recognize that this is in the past. But also part of this is a distinctive attitude towards the future. And that attitude is sort of a closed future. In particular, a closed future because, as Donald Winnicott says, that the traumatized person is always looking for their trauma in the future. So even though it happened in the past, they're not recognizing that it happened in the past. They're looking for it to come in the future. So they see it coming towards them. So that's why their imagination's closed. That's why there's less openness to change. And so I've done some work thinking about this with Edmund Husserl and this idea of pretensions, but I think it's a little bit too narrow. But in short, it really changes your ability to deal with the future. You're kind of dealing with this in this past inflected way. Another really informative slide for you. If one isn't really as able to have this openness to change, openness to the future, it kind of impacts a lot of the different virtues that might be built upon that. So Brian Trimmer says, if one feels one can make a positive impact, one must believe that things can improve. So, he's talking about the virtue of hope, but you couldn't really have hope if you are constantly looking for a trauma to be coming down, from the past. I'm sort of realizing this is a longer, I have more to say, but I'm just going to try to jump to. Okay, but anyway, trauma is going to be increased due to climate change. Trauma has this way of impacting our temporal unfolding, such that we're kind of not open to the future, and that means not being open to other people. And it also means not being able to imagine kind of other futures with others. In short, I think it's affecting the ability to create the virtue of cooperation, or it's yeah, through some mechanisms, which I haven't managed to explore quite enough in this talk, but that's where I'm going with this. So how could this be helped? Music can build cooperation and reduces trauma. There's lots of work on this. You know, I don't know if it's really connecting the two. I mean, there's two sort of separate research bodies, one about music and cooperation and one about music and trauma. So whether they could work together or not, you know, that has yet to be seen. I have lots of sources to tell you about if you'd like to talk about it another time or after. But in short, I would think that, you know, a lot of people are musical in one way or another. Most people, I even think everybody is. And it's a kind of it can be a carbon neutral activity that you can do. And it would be foreseeable that these kinds of skills of, you know, alleviating one sense of temporality that's kind of been curtailed through trauma, through experiencing like the ongoingness of time in music, and this sense of doing something together with others that you gain when you're doing music with others is also rehearsed. And so since virtues are built upon practice and habit, and you know, doing them at lower levels, and then having that virtue built up into higher situations, my sense is that what would be alleviated would be, you know, including music in the things that we value in society. You know, not just literacy, not just like higher order thinking, but those kinds of things as well. Because, yeah. So, in, you know, Luke then Wensbeen's Dirty Virtue, she claims that kind of self-change characterizes all ecological ethics. Ecologically minded people express an interest in the cultivation and transformation of their own and other people's characters. So this is kind of like emphasis on transformation and change. This has also kind of been put forward by others in a book recently, Ethical Adaptation to Climate Change. So this idea that we need to change who we are, it's not going to be just a technological fix that's going to help climate change, but also the types of people that we are, the things we're capable of doing, what we value, these also need to be adapted or changed. And so in that kind of way of looking at things, you know, as a kind of an opposite current to becoming overly instrumentalized or technologized, building in kind of musical practices into our lives in kind of decentralized community ways, I think would be really a good advantage to everybody, like even just having some musical instruments in random places in the school, things like this. There's a lot of different ways that can actually happen. But you know, we know that therapy is inaccessible and very expensive as well. Yeah, I don't think music has to be done in a music therapy context exclusively. I think it's kind of good. It has these, it could potentially, you know, have these good effects in other kind of just informal ways, possibly as a possibility. So thank you so much for listening. I know that was kind of long, kind of, you know, meandering and whatnot, but I really appreciate your attention and paying attention to this and paying attention. Thank you for your attention and for listening. I appreciate it so much.